All right, today we're going to the Kysuce region in northern Slovakia, and we're going to unravel the story of a terrifying disease that haunted its towns and villages for nearly 100 years. Now, this isn't just some dry medical history lesson. It's a really powerful story about fear, about confusion and desperation, and ultimately about the hard-won victory of science over an invisible killer. Okay, let's dive right in. First things first, you have to understand the enemy, cholera. It wasn't some gentle illness. It was a violent, lightning-fast assault on the body. I mean, these historical accounts paint a truly horrifying picture. The body dehydrates at a shocking speed. The skin literally turns dry and paper-like. The pulse vanishes, these agonizing cramps take hold, and the eyes sink deep into the skull. It was a terrifyingly swift killer. Death could come in a matter of hours. You know, for centuries, this disease was a distant problem, something that was mostly confined to Asia. But in the 1830s, it started its march across the globe. It finally reached Central Europe in 1831, carried west by Russian troops. For the people living in Kysuce, it must have felt like an invasion by an unseen army that they had absolutely no way to fight. And when that first blow finally landed, it was catastrophic. The year 1831 marks a moment of pure shock and chaos for the entire region, a year when the normal rhythms of life and death were just completely torn apart. So check this out. This is where the reality really hits you. Just take a look at the numbers for Čadca, one of the main towns in the Kysuce region. In a totally normal year, 1830, they had 132 deaths. The very next year, 447. That's more than 3 times the number of people dying. It's an absolute explosion of mortality that must have felt nothing short of apocalyptic. And look, Čadca wasn't some isolated case. This chart shows that from Čierna to Trzovka, the story was pretty much the same across all the towns and villages of Kysuce. The death tolls doubled, tripled, sometimes more. All told, about 4.5% of the entire population of the region died in that one single epidemic. It was an absolute catastrophe. So what did the authorities do? Well, their response was pure desperation. They basically threw everything they could think of at the problem. They banned all travel, shut down public markets and fairs, they posted armed guards on the main roads, and even had peasants with pitchforks blocking the smaller paths between villages. And they started digging mass graves. This was a society fighting an enemy they couldn't see, let alone understand. And the treatments? Oh, they were based on old folk wisdom and just utter desperation. Doctors tried giving sick people more meat and grain. They'd give them juniper oil, vinegar, pepper, you name it. Of course, none of it worked because nobody had any clue what was actually causing the disease. You know, it's easy to get lost in these staggering numbers, but behind every single one was a real person, a real family. This one line, just pulled from an old estate record, it tells an entire heartbreaking story. A farmer, Juro Tushro, and his wife, both gone. Their children, suddenly orphans. This was the tragedy playing out in house after house, wiping out entire families. Well, the 1831 epidemic eventually burned itself out, but the fear, that stuck around. Cholera would come back again and again over the next 40 years. This led to decades of frustration and an increasingly desperate search for answers in a world that was still, for the most part, lit by candlelight. So you have to ask yourself, right? When you're faced with this invisible killer that keeps coming back, where do you turn? What were these so-called cures that offered even a tiny sliver of hope, no matter how misguided they were? Okay, so get this. Some of the ideas were, well, they were pretty out there. An Englishman claimed that cholera was caused by disturbed electricity in the body, and his solution? A special cholera ring made of silver and tin that would supposedly restore your natural balance. And believe it or not, these things actually became pretty popular for a while. And if you thought a magic ring was weird, wait till you hear this. Over in neighboring Bohemia, a theory popped up that the intense heat from a decomposing manure pile could literally sweat the disease out of a person. So people would bury the sick up to their necks in manure just hoping for a miracle. It's a pretty shocking image that just captures the absolute depths of their desperation. And look, it wasn't just quackery or bizarre folk remedies. Even respected national figures were completely lost. In 1855, Daniel Lixicard, who was a well-known Slovak writer and publisher, he recommended a tea made from juniper as a possible cure. It just goes to show you that everyone from the farmer in the field to the most educated person in the city was just grasping at straws. And to make everything worse, they often weren't even sure what disease they were fighting. During an outbreak in 1855, the local priests, who were the ones keeping the death records, were constantly confusing cholera with dysentery. So in Čadca, for example, they only logged 7 cholera deaths, but 37 deaths from dysentery. I mean, how can you possibly fight an enemy that you can't even reliably identify? And so the heartbreaking stories just kept piling up, year after agonizing year. Look at this record from the 1867 epidemic. Adam Hlavu, just 27 years old, died on September 2nd. The very next day, his wife Anna was gone too. This wasn't some abstract threat. It was a thief that stole futures and tore families apart in the space of 24 hours. But then, after more than 40 years of darkness, a corner was finally about to be turned. The era of superstition and pure guesswork was ending, and the age of science was just beginning to dawn, bringing with it the first real ray of hope. Now, it's a tragic irony, really, but the path toward that light began with the worst tragedy of all. In 1873, the most catastrophic epidemic of the century just ripped through Kysuce. It killed nearly 2,500 people, 2,460, in this one region. It was a disaster on an unimaginable scale, but it created this undeniable urgency to find a real answer once and for all. And that disaster set off a chain reaction. Suddenly, things started moving fast. The horror of 1873 led directly to a new public health law just 3 years later. Then came the massive scientific breakthrough. In 1883, the cholera bacillus was finally identified under a microscope. The invisible enemy now had a face. And that discovery paved the way for brand new science-based regulations in 1886 that would change everything. And with that new scientific knowledge, a completely different era began. The fight was no longer about finding desperate last-minute cures. It was all about building smart, effective prevention. I mean, just look at this contrast. It is literally night and day. On one side, you have the old beliefs: disturbed electricity, bad air, magic rings. On the other, you have the scientific reality. The disease spreads through contaminated water and human waste. The focus snapped from all these bizarre cures to practical solutions: disinfection, clean water, and proper sanitation. And the new regulations from 1886, they're going to sound like common sense to us, but back then, they were revolutionary. Keep your house clean. Move manure piles away from your home and your water source. Isolate sick people in a separate house to stop the spread. These weren't magic spells. They were logical, science-based steps that finally gave communities the power to actually protect themselves. And for the very first time, they had real weapons. Instead of juniper tea, they had chemicals. Homes were fumigated with sulfur. Clothes were washed with phenol. Contaminated items were burned. They even started disinfecting patient waste directly, attacking the disease right at its source. This was the birth of modern public health. And the result? Cholera never again reached epidemic levels in Kysuce. But the memory of that terrible century, it left a deep scar on the region. Their long, brutal fight, from panicked superstition all the way to scientific understanding, is a powerful testament to human resilience. And it leaves us with a question. What does the century-long battle of the people of Kysuce teach us today about facing new, unknown threats with courage, with reason, and with a relentless search for the truth?